Have you ever done something for so long, you're sure there's no better way to do it? And then someone else comes along and using a new technique shows you there is a better way? Sometimes it's because they're able to observe a process, do some math, and figure out how to make it more efficient. We've seen it in professional sports. Moneyball changed baseball, and more recently, maximizing three-point shots in basketball have both changed how these sports are played after almost a century of playing them differently. In episode 12 of EB Spoke, the podcast, Changing the Game of Cybersecurity, I speak with Carter Schoenberg, whose book, Why Cybersecurity Fails in America, applies this same reasoning to cybersecurity. Maybe we're struggling to win in defending our companies because we're playing the game wrong. Welcome, and we have Carter Schoenberg with us today. He and I have met here in the Atlanta area. We've been to several cybersecurity events. He recently shared his book with me, Why Cybersecurity Fails in America. I got the chance to read that, and I'm like, we should probably get together and really dive into that topic. I can't start the conversation without saying your headline sounds like a challenge almost, but at the same time, it's so true. Every year, the breaches get more expensive. Every year, the defenses get more expensive. Is that a sustainable path where we just keep spending more money, but they keep stealing more money? That feels like failure.
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to be able to be on your show. I do not believe it is a sustainable path. More money is being spent on cyber today than it ever has before. And I'm going to argue that our risk posture is not improving proportionate to that level of spend. I believe that the crux of the issue is organizations have historically been focusing on buying the next new shiny widget, which in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. But one, generally those widgets are underutilized because the knowledge base of the staff is not commensurate with what it is necessary to fully maximize those newer technologies. And two, sometimes those decision makers are being led by product marketing and sales initiatives that may not necessarily run true to what the actual risk exposure is of the client in the first place.
I was actually at a CISO conference a few years ago. And so, fast forward to today, multiply all these numbers, and around the table, the average was 70 to 80 cybersecurity products installed at a company. And at the time, I worked for a relatively small company. I'm like, there's no way. Like, that doesn't even make sense. And then I started counting as a small company, I got up to 20. And so then you think of Fortune 500, Fortune 50, 80 seems like a small number, right, at that point. And yet it's a terrible number when you think about exactly what you just said. How do you have domain expertise in 80 different products in a cybersecurity team? How do you make sure all those are configured? The answer is they're not.
Yeah. In a former chapter of my life, when I had my own business, we were actually reached out to by Department of Homeland Security. And what they were actually evaluating was to bring an organization like mine in to be able to make a determination on, let's say, for keeping the math simple, they have 10 products in their tech stack, each of which is costing them $1 million a year. So they have a $10 million a year investment just by default. Well, when you're evaluating of the technologies in that security stack, what other teams actually evaluating and responding to in terms of alerts? Well, we were not a part of that specific engagement. What I can advise is, especially with work that I've done previously, past lives with Homeland Security, the majority of the tech stack is not what is providing the alerts. It's usually a very finite percentage of it, whether that's 25, 30%. And the reason why I think that's important for your listeners to understand is if you have a $10 million investment, but only 30% is being maximized, you're running at a loss now of $7 million a year in that scenario. You are just sitting on fire. You completely just burned cash with absolutely no return on investment, no means of being able to defend the basis of why you're continuing the investment other than potential political considerations. In some cases, being able to have a conformance regime where those other 7 elements are necessary to check a box, but in the course of checking that box, it's not really adding any material value to your day-to-day operations.
I think what's important there is, to your point, we're spending a lot of money, spending it ineffectively, and we're spending it against a perceived financial risk that we may or may not even be accurately estimating. So if you're a big enough company, cybersecurity is definitely a $10 million problem from a risk perspective. But if you haven't done that math, then are you even balancing that?
Agree 100%. I think that the majority of organizations, when they're evaluating what their cyber investment strategy is going to look like, it's generally not predicated upon the type of risk that they should be actually evaluating. And what do I mean by that? We have all seen the matrices of likelihood, impact. Well, if you're defining yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 out of 6.4 or a moderate, how do you defend that in a crisis event where either your clients, your constituents, or your business partners now are taking issue with you and potentially leveraging a civil suit against you for potential negligence?
Exactly. There's so many aspects of risk, right?
Absolutely. That was one of the cornerstone reasons why I thought it was necessary to provide some of the findings in the book that you were just holding up as it applies to that. So that way we could have more of a meaningful dialogue as security professionals on what do we actually mean when we're trying to convey risk to the actual decision makers, the C-suite, boards of directors. We are hearing more and more frequently that while boards are becoming more increasingly aware and concerned with cyber, how they are actually changing what they do on their normal quarterly reviews or annual reviews, there's not a lot of information that supports that there's actual change to improve systemic risk to their organizations. It seems to be almost anecdotal or bandwagon. Yep, we got to get ahead of this. We need to be able to bring in the CISOs or the directors of security or the CIOs to better educate us. But it's in that level of communication where it still remains problematic.
And you mentioned the book has a lot of your findings in it, a lot of your observations from your career. Let's take a step back, maybe just give us a bit of an introduction, your career, what brought you to this point?
Certainly. So many people in the area of cyber come to it one of two ways, either from a background in IT or the military. I actually left a career in law enforcement. I ended my career as a homicide detective with DeKalb County, which for the majority of people reviewing, if you're not in the Atlanta area, you wouldn't know that's pretty much where Atlanta resides, actually two different counties, Fulton and DeKalb. And statistically speaking, as it applies to homicides in the United States, for every 20, 18 somehow, somewhere narcotic related, once domestic violence was wrong person, wrong place, wrong time. And what we were starting to see in the late 1990s were individuals and organizations that we knew were directly responsible for multiple kilo deals moving towards computer crime because they could make just as much, if not potentially more money than narcotics trade. And the laws had not successfully evolved to prosecute them. And from just an intellectual standpoint, that one-to-many type of crime was far more appealing to me than a traditional one-to-one crime because somebody was messing with somebody's turf and they took them out kind of thing. And as a result of that, I'd made the decision to leave the department. I was soon picked up by a company called Internet Security Systems, which was based in Atlanta, and very, very fortunate to be exposed to arguably some of the best and the brightest in the world at that point in time, learning the trade, working in a SOC, being fortunate enough to be part of the organization that was tasked with standing up the IT Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the ITISAC, applying significant lessons learned on how do you build collaboration, trust for information sharing, and then just continuing my career in a variety of different positions supporting industry and government to where I am now, which is with Soundwave Consulting as their chief cybersecurity officer and also their vice president of cybersecurity solutions. So I have two responsibilities, our own internal corporate infrastructure and also our forward-facing professional and managed services with the design, the implementation, and the ongoing operations and management of those solutions.
That's a great story. And I think you're right. Most people don't think of cybersecurity professionals as coming out of law enforcement, despite the fact that cybersecurity is to prevent cybercrime, right? Without law enforcement, we would not have any chance of having cybersecurity. It's a great partnership to begin with.
I do think having that investigative background definitely has served me well, especially with what we're doing right now, which is the primary focus for my line of business is on the cybersecurity maturity model certification. Timing is great for today's session because I just saw that 48 CFR has now made it over to OMB. It's in its final stage, and if all goes to plan, will probably be published in October with a full ratification of December of this year, 2025. Having said that, I can tell all of your viewers right now, when we're providing consultative guidance or even doing formal assessments, some organizations, they don't even have their cameras on when they're doing it virtually. I prefer they have the camera on because it's not so much of what the individual is responding, but how are they responding based on a variety of different things I'm going to be looking at, their eye movement, their body language, their posture, because that might be telegraphing to me, not necessarily that they're lying, but maybe they don't really understand, or maybe they're trying to raise a false flag on how well they're actually doing it. So that might actually incline me to ask the question a different way or ask an entirely different question to be able to independently validate, is what they're telling me factually accurate?
You brought up a great point. The investigative side is going to play into that, the understanding, and of course, the fact that cybersecurity is a human activity as well, right? We talk about the technical controls, We talked about that 80 different products that we're spending $10 million on that are poorly configured. But at the end of the day, these are human operated systems, right? And human behaviors are what we're actually being targeted by and targeting.
Yeah, having been in cyber now for over 25 years, one thing is a data point that I will still stand by. About roughly 45%-ish of all technology-related vulnerabilities are directly associated with gaps in either operational or managerial processes.
I want to turn the conversation a little bit. We've talked a lot about numbers, a lot about estimating risk. And I think the other people from cybersecurity come from IT, they come from military, they come from kind of those core areas. They don't often come from finance or a math background. And yet math is such a critical part. Before we dive into that, I was listening to a radio show about the NBA, and recently 3-point shots have become more important. And the reason is a 3-point shot is worth what? Something like 2.2 points, because you miss some, you hit some, but 2.2 points is more than 2 points.
Right.
And so if you think about the math of, if you want to win a game, 2.2 points is better than 1.8 points or whatever the 2 points are worth, right?
Correct.
And so people sat down, they did math, and they said, we can actually win more effectively by changing the way we play the game. And then, of course, I'm reminded of Moneyball, where the exact same thing happened at a complex scale, where by doing the math against the baseball statistics, they improved the game. And what's kind of cool is both of those were 100-year-old sports at this point, right? Like, we've been playing it forever, and it turns out you've been playing it wrong all along. Cybersecurity is not 100 years old, and so we are almost certainly doing it wrong, just statistically. Right? We have done this long enough to know how the best way. You bring up Moneyball in your book as well as an example of the math matters and figuring out what is the math telling us about the problem, and then how do we apply to that. Give us a little bit on that.
Moneyball is a movie about baseball, specifically the Oakland A's in the early 2000s. In my opinion, it's arguably one of the best movies about business that I've seen. And one of the things that really struck a chord with me is early in the movie, for context for people that haven't seen it, the Oakland A's lost 3 of their key players. And now the Oakland A's are trying to figure out what can they do to basically build up their bench to replace those 3 key players. Brad Pitt's character is Billy Beane, who is the general manager of the Oakland A's at that point. And he is listening to his scouts, the talents review board, if you will, that have collectively assembled a list of all these different data points that they're looking at. And he kind of does a gesture where in the course of that gesture, everybody's like looking at him. Well, okay, Dan, do you have anything that you want to add to this? And he goes, you guys are just asking the exact same questions and you're not even looking at the problem. And he goes, oh, we understand what the problem is. He goes, good, tell me what the problem is. And they start throwing out these things. And he's like, wrong. You're not even looking at the problem the right way. And the moment that I watched that on the screen, it hit me. Oh my God, this is exactly the same type of challenge that exists in cybersecurity. Everything that we've been doing has been predicated upon a legacy model that maybe at one point in time was valuable, but it was only valuable because of the information that was available at the time to come up with the construct. Meaning, vulnerabilities, likelihood times risk, likelihood times the vulnerability kind of thing is those data points are no longer relevant in my professional opinion. It has now come down to how can we evaluate what are the costs of ownership left a boom, at boom, and right a boom. Full stop. Now, in the course of my career, especially when I was with Motorola, we had an opportunity to do an assessment for Mecklenburg County, which is where the city of Charlotte is located. And I wanted to take an idea that I had and put it into practice. People that were on my team, they were probably 5-10 years younger than me, and they were all very much of the opinion of this is ridiculous. These metrics don't make any sense. Well, I was the PM, so too bad. This is the way they were going forward with it. And when we gave the final presentation, the CIO for the city, I can't remember her name, but very polished, very elegant. She was looking at the report and very bewildered. She said, I've never seen a report that looks like this. And people on my own team were kind of like chuffing, like told you so kind of thing. And she looked at these individuals very perplexed. She quietly closed the report and very sternly said, do you understand this gives me exactly the data points I need to justify my future investment strategy? Because what we did is rather than saying that you have 100 critical vulnerabilities, and again, that's oversimplification. If you come in and you try to tell your management team, oh, we have 14,000 vulnerabilities, what does it really mean to them? Because all you're doing is speaking in a tech jargon that they could frankly care less about. But what we were able to do, Erik, is to translate that into something that was a little bit more meaningful to them. Meaning, one, for each of these critical vulnerabilities, what it's going to cost you to take it offline, remediate it, and then put it back into a fully production environment. And so we had that number. And I think it was roughly $1,700 some odd dollars per device. And they had a total of 16 devices that they were going to have to go through this exercise with. In relationship to what is that cost of ownership in a crisis event? Because now not only are you doing that, but now you have duty to notify, all these other exercises. And what's that cost calculation? Lest we forget, if those devices are compromised and have to be taken offline, how many 911 calls are not going to be dispatched, or just in the best case scenario, delay? And then out of that, what percentage of those are of an aggravated nature? Robbery, gunshot, things along those lines. And frankly, nobody that's working in the government realm wants to deal with that political hot potato. Wait a second. So you're telling me, and Atlanta was the city that dealt with several years ago. Atlanta, Baltimore, there were a number of jurisdictions in Texas not that long ago. And it kind of begs the question on how many people had to lose their lives? How many people had to be victims of highly violent, aggravated crimes because the police, by no fault of the officer on the ground, but because of a technical glitch, prevented them from getting to where they had to be in a timely fashion?
The headlines are financial, right there. We lost money, the companies lost money, whatever it is, it feels financial. But you're so right that this actually has a human, real life and death impact as well that gets overlooked a lot. So a different framing of something that gets talked about a lot, but forgotten just how critical that can be.
Well, in one of my former jobs, the company that I worked at, they were responsible for supporting municipal co-ops as it applies to distribution and generation of electricity. And when I was exposed to how woefully unprepared and inadequate their cyber posture is, it kind of begs the question of what is it going to take? What is that crescendo event going to have to look like for significant changes in the culture? And the only conclusion that I was able to arrive at, Eric, is it's going to have to be an exposure related claim, meaning that you had somebody, let's say, that died because they froze to death because the electricity wasn't on, because the electricity wasn't working, because the provider was compromised. And it was something that was pretty easy to resolve, but for whatever the reason, they elected not to take action. Or conversely, you have an elderly person that dies due to exposure to heat because the air conditioning is not working because, again, same issue, because electricity is not being made available to the homes in question. And it is unfortunate, but as a culture, even as it applies to even basic traffic principles, you have to have, and not that I would expect the general listener of this session to understand that, but, and I'm not talking about major intersections, but even just very, very basic intersections. If you have a traffic light there, I assure you that traffic light was not always there. You probably had a four-way stop sign, and you probably had X number of accidents with Y percentage of fatalities before the jurisdiction justified transitioning that from a four-way stop sign, including an actual stop traffic light. It's an unfortunate approach that creates casualties, but unfortunately, even with cyber, it's not too dissimilar. I can't think of one business owner, president, CEO, however you want to define the role, where once they were compromised and they had to go through all of this heartache that they said, yeah, oh yeah, we saw this coming. They all take the exact same position. It's not going to happen to us. What gives you that level of hubris of thinking it's not going to happen to you? I do think that there's a degree of misunderstanding from the C-suite, but I also think that it is very heavily dependent on, so why do you think you're not going to get compromised? Well, we're secure. Okay, well, what inclines you to think that you're secure? Well, my IT person told me so.
Sure.
Well, that's historically has been rather problematic. In fact, the data supports almost the exact opposite in that case.
Who from the outside told you that you're secure too, right? We all have our own personal blind spots, including the IT guy of our company, right? And of course, the cyber criminals are always going to be more motivated and more creative than a defense team because that's how they make money, is to get through.
And they are far better financed than the average IT workshop is, by far. It's always a fence and ladder game. I'm very much of the opinion of man can create it, man can defeat it somehow, some way. And it's just, again, how do we evaluate our own understanding of what our risk posture is? When I had my own company, we were actually commissioned by an insurance trade organization of coming up with how can we create a standard that all underwriters and brokers would pull from to determine the applicant's worthiness of a cyber policy. And we had actually created an interactive questionnaire, and it was weighted based on different points. And one of the questions that we would ask is, has your organization been exposed to a cyber incident? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, okay, fine, you have a certain score. But then several questions down, and you can't go back, is when was your last penetration test? Well, we've never done one. Then how would you know how vulnerable you are? So not only did you take a ding on that question, it went back and course corrected the initial response in terms of the score of that one as well. And that kind of comes back to the approach that I alluded to at the onset of this recording, where sometimes you have to ask the question multiple ways to actually get to the God's honest truth of what is going on.
To your point, it's not that they're lying. It's just the way the question's framed changes the way they think about, oh yeah, we don't do that. When you ask this other question, we're thinking about this, but you then made us remember we don't do that other thing. Like, yeah, we have backups. Oh, we don't test them though. Oh, then you probably don't have backups.
Perfect. Or my favorite one is that the admin account login information for the backup is identical to the production environment, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of protecting yourself from a ransomware event.
Yeah, we have backups and they're encrypted too. So corrupted, whatever term you want to use, compromised. We kind of kick things off with why cybersecurity is failing. And the evidence shows that no matter how much we throw at it, we're still behind. Your book and the conversation has alluded to some of the things that we can do better. What's a core thing that we need to rethink about how we're doing it and a different way to think about that?
I would say that this notion of evaluating risk based on high, moderate, or low, just move away from that altogether. Do your own research on one, what is your business that you're supporting or your enterprise, even if it's government? What is its mission? What is its core capabilities? What is it the most highly dependent upon? And what are the soft targets that make it easily accessible? Even if you operate under the assumption of, well, we haven't been hit, so therefore we're good. What is the worst case scenario? If you had Tom Clancy or the biggest horror author getting in your network, coming in with a crisis event, what would that look like? And I'm very much of the opinion that you have to now be able to pivot from that to now being able to understand how you're going to translate these technical findings into a business vernacular. And one of the things that I like to be able to do is I'm going to share a screen really quick because, as they say, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think that's very important for organizations to understand, even if you are able to better understand what is that exposure in terms of interruption or ransomware or a data breach, and then being able to understand what is that exposure pre-insurance and even after insurance. Those are just components of the calculus. For the calculus to be fully understood and ratified, those data points need to be evaluated against the top line, bottom line numbers of the company. Meaning, what's that cyber exposure in relationship to revenue or earnings before interest, taxes, and appreciation, or even free cash flow? From using the model that I have, I don't want to say perfected because there's always an opportunity for improvement, but by using this model, generally speaking, our biggest champion with our engagements are not the IT of the security team. It's usually either the CEO or the CFO, because now we are putting into a level of context that makes sense to them. If you are an internal security professional, I would say it is incumbent upon you, and with how fair that is, we'll talk about that in a second, but it is ultimately going to be incumbent upon you as the security professional to work with your risk team to be able to better understand, all right, what is that fault tolerance? Because if you say, what's your risk appetite? No, it's kind of high. What does that even mean? It's kind of high. Give me a dollar amount. Well, if you're saying that you are willing to invest up to 3% of earnings to prevent a crisis event. Okay. Well, if you're now coming back to these metrics that I was just showcasing, and you're now putting in a context of, all right, here's how much it's going to cost us. Well, that's a really big number, but this is still well below that 3% target. So why are we even debating this? Even by your own acknowledgement of what is an acceptable practice, we're now within that context of being able to take action.
And real quick, for anyone that's on the audio version of this conversation, that diagram is in your book, but is it online as well, or is it just?
It's in the book right now. One of the things that, as a result of some of the feedback from the book that has been brought to my attention, is that there might be an interest in doing like a one-day type of boot camp on training CISOs or directors of security on how to learn these general concepts and to do so in a way that with two different use cases, learning from what they did in use case one to then being able to show how they have significantly advanced their communication style in use case two.
All right. So you mentioned the fairness factor of the team and how they're approaching it. Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So I've seen and heard quite a bit of gripes, if you will, on the security side of the house of, well, leadership doesn't get it. They don't believe us. They don't provide us the buy-in that's necessary. And at a certain point in time, you have to take a step back and ask, is it that they really don't care, or are you just not communicating in a way that resonates with them? Which comes back to these data points that I was just showcasing. Now, having said that, I think it is improbable, and I think it's actually, to take it to a greater extent, you are living in fantasy land if you think that your CEO or your CFO or your chief risk officer are going to become cyber experts. It's not going to happen. That's just not a reality, which means that the only way to resolve the calculus is to improve your own capabilities on how you are working and collaborating with your peers in that capacity. Meaning, are you taking a PMP course? Are you taking a strategic communications course? Are you doing things that are going to make you more easy to understand in these boardroom meetings? And again, I still will receive, but why is the burden all on us? Well, I'm not really sure what to tell you. That's just life. I mean, that's just, sometimes life is not fair, but at the end of the day, I'm going to ask you, how well is your current approach working? You have to ask yourself what is the so what in any variety of scenarios that you contend with. And if you are of the opinion that your current approach is not working, what do you have to lose by trying this new approach? Is it more time and resources for you to invest in? Absolutely. But make no mistake, this is really the only path forward that I can see to foster adoption and to reduce by numeric value to improve the risk posture of the organizations that security professionals are supporting.
I've spoken about this topic myself, but the world of cyber risk quantification is the industry term for what we've been talking about. And there's a lot of different frameworks under that. But the point of it is cyber risk should translate to business risk. Business risk is a dollar, right? That's how we think about business risk, is in dollars. Curious your thoughts, cyber risk quantification, and where you see that evolving from a practice that us security practitioners need to be understanding better.
So from my perspective, and I love the way that you frame that, I've always been very much a very staunch advocate of, if you cannot translate in terms of business, which is basically what is your cost in legal exposure, all you're doing is you're spitting in the wind, because all that is going to continue to happen is this legacy approach of, well, cyber is an IT thing. No, it's not. It is a business risk that is in the 21st century commensurate with fire, theft, or flood. And if you are not in a position to be able to communicate it in that type of framing, then you are putting yourself and your business at a strategic disadvantage when compared to its competitive landscape. As it applies to quantifying, there's a framework out there called FAIR. I've seen the FAIR model. I'm not going to sit there and take pot shots at the FAIR model. What I will say is, one, I think that the data points that they are looking at, there's room for improvement to improve the fidelity of the data that is being captured. And two, the tools that are used for determining the FAIR model are based on what is the accuracy and fidelity of the information being provided in the first place. So you could be looking potentially at garbage in, garbage out. If you have a junior IT person being tasked with completing the data points, the chances that the accuracy are spot on for the actual outputs, slim to none, I would say. If you have a risk professional providing these inputs, but they have not collaborated with the IT or the security team, again, probably from a business acumen standpoint, a little bit more acutely aware of it, but the actual numeric value that the FAIR model provides will probably be incorrect. There is a GRC tool out there that I've become familiar with called X Analytics, which I think is about as close to the model that I've designed as possible. And what it will do is, as an example, Erik, is, let's say from the initial gap review that it has identified that for access control, you have $8 million of exposure. And what it will do is it will be able to advise you that you have $8 million of exposure and you're at about 50%. You're at that 50% mark of being able to limit your risk. Well, with a toggle switch, you can either toggle to the left or toggle to the right. What's it going to cost me to buy myself down to $1.2 million of risk? And being able to show you what the actual cost calculation is. Because if you're able to reduce your risk from 8 million to 1.2, and it's going to cost you $200,000, that's kind of a no-brainer. If it's going to cost you almost as much to implement the risk reduction as your risk exposure from a business side, why would you even consider doing that? But even with X Analytics, there are some elements that I've seen in there that are not accounting for the data points that I am accounting for, albeit from a manual process.
To your point, the Quality of data matters, your data sources, which is probably why everybody starts with the high, medium, low, because you don't actually have to have data to say low.
Right.
Making a guess is okay when it's low, medium, high. Now give me 1 through 10. Well, now I need to do some math. Give me 1 through 100. Okay, that's way too precise for me to be able to, without good data, to have a meaningful number. So yeah, the quality of the data is so critical to any complicated model, any sophisticated model, I should say. We've covered a lot of different topics, skimmed the surface of a few, but as we get to this point, I'd love to hear kind of what's a thing that somebody listening to this, especially if they're in the cybersecurity role, what should they be thinking about today to do differently that they may not have thought of already?
If you are in the field of cybersecurity, first, I'm going to qualify it. What is your level of professionalism? Are you a junior? Are you a mid? Or are you a senior? If you are a junior or a mid-level employee, first give some serious consideration on, from you as a professional, what are you ultimately looking to accomplish? I hear time and time again, well, what do you, I want to do something in cyber. Okay, what does that mean? Because there's a pretty broad level of labor categories that are out there. All right, well, I want to be a CISO someday. Okay, lofty goal. Certainly commend the individual for wanting to go there. What research have you done to be able to identify what are the core characteristics that are consistent with the CISO? And then reverse engineer it. So oversimplifying. So you have a CISO, and then maybe below that, you'd be a director of IT. So if you now understand what are those core components for a CISO, what are those core components for a director of IT, and then creating that path on what you need to accomplish, whether it's by professional certification, depth and breadth of experience,
Yeah.
external courseware, maybe of a business nature. But without being able to do that, all you're doing is just creating an opportunity for you to hit a glass ceiling. And the reality is, especially with the advent of this full court press that we're seeing with artificial intelligence, I could clearly see where a number of positions in IT and security can be replicated in an automated fashion. And so all the more reason why being able to communicate the risks in a way that we have been showcasing today are actually going to ensure job security for you in the future. If you are in the senior level position, and again, I'm not talking about for those that are like a Fortune 100, Fortune 500. Those kinds of individuals are usually very well adapted in these topics that we have covered. But once you get outside of the Fortune 500, as a general question, when was the last time you took a master class on how to run a meeting? When was the last time you took a master class on executive communications? Well, I don't need to do that. Yeah, you kind of do. One of the other things is you have to be mindful on corporate politics. I have seen so many people, I'm not going to get myself involved in that because I'm above that. I want to focus on doing what I'm doing. Well, I hate to break it to you, you can't escape corporate politics. One of the things that we actually convey when we are providing consultative guidance to our clients is when we provide you our draft report, we understand that the internal politics of each company is different. So if you're going to tell us you have this written as 6, but we know board member number 4 is going to lose his mind if it doesn't say half a dozen. As long as it doesn't change the material finding, that's fine. But we want to be able to make sure that it's being communicated in a way that's going to foster adoption rather than positioning our clients to step on political landmines.
I think that's great advice. Communication is still a core skill. I don't know what the size is. Maybe it's the 140 people or whatever, but politics becomes part of every organization once maybe it's more than one person, right? At some point. Obviously, the book, Why Cybersecurity Fails in America. If somebody wants to learn more about you, the organization, how do they find you? How do they reach out to you?
Sure. It's pretty prominent on LinkedIn. Oddly enough, there are 2 Carter Schoenbergs, but one is clearly a lot younger than myself. So look for the one that's based in the greater Atlanta area. In addition to LinkedIn, usually featured publicly speaking at a number of different conferences throughout the United States and hopefully starting next year, also in Europe. And also the book is available on Amazon. And if you are able to access my LinkedIn profile, there's actually a link there on that will take you directly on how to buy the book. And in negotiations with a few industry trade organizations right now on the concept of creating the one-day course for training CISOs on these core competencies. So hopefully more to come in the coming months with that.
Thank you for being here today. I appreciate the conversation, having the opportunity to read the book and get that perspective. What do you want to close this out with?
I would love to, you as the interviewer, since you had an opportunity to read the book, what would you say are the top 2 things that struck you as maybe an aha in the book that you didn't previously have either exposure or insight into?
Honestly, a lot of it's your experience. Obviously, I don't have exposure and insight to your own experience. but the way that your experience drove you to those conclusions, the companies that you got to work with, the opportunities that you experienced, your law enforcement background, that perspective really helped tie it together in a way that, like, I may understand the concepts, but I don't have that framing of them in the way that you do. So that was absolutely helpful. The other thing that we didn't talk about today, but is definitely another piece of this that's very important conversation, the HR and employee growth and training. You mentioned a little bit, if you're trying to be a CISO, what's your roadmap? And now let's flip that around. If you're an employer, how do you build internal capacity and capability? How do you hire it? How do you recruit it? That's a super difficult question right now in cyber as well. And I know you touch on that in the book as well. So I think that's the other piece that we didn't get to talk about today, but is certainly as important as everything else that we did talk about.
Well, one of the things I would like to leave your listeners with is, so two of my first team members, one is a career changer. He's actually a couple of years older than myself, and the other came over from IT, about 30 years of age. And one of the things that I had tasked them with is, okay, you guys have been around me enough. You've seen how I provide executive presentations to our clients. I'm going to give you a scenario, and you're going to pitch me like I'm the client, what the executive briefing is going to be. Here are the core data points, and you have 30 days. And they're thinking, 30 days? Why so long? Well, then you have absolutely no reason not to knock it out of the park, right? So 30 days comes and goes, and it was a very interesting lesson for both of them. One, with regards to not understanding you shouldn't be using clip art. You should be using more dynamic type of interactions to keep the audience engaged. And oddly enough, the younger of the two, he was able to time his narrative to the transitions. He actually did a very good job with it. But at the end of it, they were both like, man, we really thought 30 days, you were just out of your mind. Oh my God, the level of time it takes to make one of these things captivating is like, yeah, that's why I gave you guys 30 days. But now what I can't say with that is we went through that exercise 2 times. So we went through that once, and then we went about 2 months, and then we did it again. But what I will say is, even though we're in cyber, and even though I believe that the business team, giving them that level of professional growth and development, I would certainly feel comfortable if I had to call in sick for a public speaking engagement. One of these two could step in my place, and I would still feel very, very comfortable with that. But that's one of those core things. I also think that if you're going to wear a CISO hat or a director hat, it is incumbent upon you on not only making sure that your daily operations tempo goes without missing a beat, but understanding that part of that ops tempo is how do you position your team members for growth and success.
Yes. Succession planning is its own super important part of this as well, right? So lots of topics to unpack. Maybe we'll have some more episodes in the future, or people can just grab the book and get some insights. But either way, I really appreciate you being on. Enjoyed the conversation and look forward to more.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, Erik.
Thanks for listening to EB Spoke, the podcast. This podcast was produced by Erik Boemanns, founder of the fractional CTO and CISO firm Vulnerabilities, and features a wide variety of topics. Keep listening for more topics in the future, including cybersecurity, risk, compliance, and more.